ministry and more motivation.
DeShawn.
More entertainment, more ministry and more motivation.
DeShawn.
She'll give you more, more, more.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Live with DeShawn. I'm your host, DeShawn Moore, where I bring you more hope, more inspiration, and more motivation. Well, this particular episode is so special to me. My special guest is author and attorney, Mr. Chervis Isom, and his book is entitled The Newspaper Boy. People can change, and Mr. Isom's story is proof positive of that. Check him out. Attorney Chervis Isom grew up in Birmingham, Alabama in the 50s and 60s, in a city that was home to some of the most notorious racist acts in the civil rights era, peaking in 1963 with Commissioner of Public Safety Bull Connor's violent enforcement of segregation and a church bombing that killed 4 black children. That backstory makes Isom's personal story even more remarkable. As a teenager, he was influenced by the racist views of his society, particularly those of famous segregationalist and Klansman Asa Carter after the U.S. Supreme Court's Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954. However, his racist mindset was slowly swayed the opposite way by the patience and compassion of the Millers, 2 of his customers on his paper route. It's in an iconic real-life struggle as Isom made a moral choice between the evils of racism and the angel of reconciliation and change. And now my guest, author of The Newspaper Boy, Mr. Chervis Isom. Chervis, again, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Now, you're an attorney, you're a lawyer.
I heard you say, DeShawn, you referred to me as a young man, and I do appreciate that, but that's an inaccuracy.
Chervis, you keep correcting me, and that's the marketing publicist inside of me. We promote, and so you look young, so just say thank you.
Thank you.
Now, Chervis.
Okay.
Isom, he's coming all the way from Birmingham, Alabama. He is in my hometown, which also makes this book very special to me and so many others who are watching who are from Birmingham, Alabama. I'm in Fort Wayne, Indiana, so a lot of the people that live here are from Birmingham, Chervis. So when I got here, I felt at home.
Good. I'm glad people from Birmingham are here. Birmingham's a unique place, and I'll talk about that maybe in a few minutes.
Yes. Well, your remarkable book, The Newspaper Boy, it's a coming-of-age story of a young man growing up during the civil rights era. What is amazing, Chervis, is that you took all of your memories or a lot of your memories and you put it into a book. Now, most of us, we don't even remember when we were our first day of kindergarten. Some of us do, but a lot of us don't. Tell me just a little bit about yourself and what motivated you to write this book.
Well, I grew up in Birmingham. My family came from Northwest Alabama, a country place. I was born there. We moved here when I was about 3 or 4 years old.
Okay.
My dad was a sharecropper, and he didn't make a living very well doing that, as most sharecroppers don't. And so he came to Birmingham to work in industry. He would have been in the coal mines. He would have done whatever he could. But he got a job driving a truck for Republic Steel. Mm-hmm. And from there, he parlayed that into a career of driving. He ultimately found himself with Greyhound bus lines. Mm-hmm. And that is, I guess, a key part of my growing up, because, as you all know, the first movement in civil rights, I suppose, to my knowledge, was in transportation.
Absolutely.
And he was on the front lines of that. He was working as a Jim Crow culture, mm-hmm. and it was his job to tell people where to sit. And you understand all that background. And so I grew up listening to his frustrations, mm-hmm. And having to deal with black folks who didn't want to go to the back of the bus. And so he was a man of his time. He came from Northwest Alabama. Mm-hmm. It's a hill country. I don't know if I'm sure a lot of you who are from Alabama know this. Alabama's 2/3 white, roughly, and 1/3 black. But in some places in South Alabama, the percentage would be 90% black, 10% white. And in North Alabama, in the hill country, there may be no blacks. For example, my father was 16 years old before he ever saw a black face to face. So he came to Birmingham with that kind of mindset that blacks were aliens, aliens to him. And that was all reinforced by the Jim Crow law, which said, essentially black folks are second-class citizens. And so it was hard for him to deal with these. He had never had a conversation with a person of color until he began telling people where to sit on the bus. And that, of course, was not a conversation. That's the way I grew up. So, we were racist and couldn't help it because that's the way it was. And so my story is essentially a story of evolution coming out of that culture. And the way that happened, and it happened earlier than maybe it would have in a natural way, I suppose I would come out of it eventually, in college and in life. But it hit me when I was about 16 years old. I had some folks that moved on to my newspaper route who were from the far north, and they came down here without any bigotry and so forth. And so Ms. Miller was important to me because essentially every Saturday she took me to school, and I would go by to collect, and she would teach me something. And it was usually about broadening my viewpoint on race. There came a time when I couldn't talk to her about that anymore because I didn't want to set her off, So we talked about a lot of other things too, but essentially she broadened my viewpoint and changed, in many ways, changed my life. And so I think that was a key part of my evolution was meeting Ms. Miller. Maybe I wouldn't have listened to her, DeShawn, except I couldn't help it. She was really beautiful. And 16-year-old boys listen to beautiful girls.
Yes.
So, so I had, anyway, so that was beginning with my evolution. So I don't know, maybe you need to ask me a question. I grew up on the sidewalks. I grew up on the north side of Birmingham. I grew up in a neighborhood called Norwood, and we're close to North Birmingham and Druid Hills in that area. And it's a nice urban neighborhood, and I feel like Norwood is home now, even though I don't live there anymore. It's still home. Strongly about that. Everybody wants to go home again.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Every time I go home, and we talked about this while we were on the phone, since I've moved away, Chervis, I have a greater appreciation of my history coming from Birmingham, Alabama. Everything was not nice. It was not beautiful. We were I can't say we, but my ancestors, my great-great-grandmother, my grandmother grew up under the Jim Crow laws, the segregation laws. They experienced that. So when I come home and I'm like, wow, I am on the soil of my grandmother and my grandparents who also fought in the civil rights era. They marched in Selma, Birmingham. They did. My husband's uncle was a deacon at the 16th Street Baptist Church. He actually was there, when the bombing went on. So all of this history is amazing. So I tell all of my Birmingham residents, embrace the city that you're in. You should be proud, and you should continue to tell the young people about what our city did.
Hey, we've come a long way, DeShawn. We got a long way to go. But but this city was unique to any other city in the South. Montgomery, Jackson, Mobile, Atlanta, they were all pre-Civil War cities. Birmingham was formed after the Civil War was over. And it was formed here by industrialists who came here to build steel mills and make steel. And they needed work. And they got workers of color from South Alabama, and they got hillbillies, you know. They got the white workers from the hills who'd never worked, never been
Yeah.
around. And it was a volatile brew of, you know, race. And then you add to that all of the thousands and thousands of immigrants who came in who were mostly Catholic. And Birmingham was a tough place because the Klan hated Catholics almost as much as the colored, and it was all designed to drive people apart and cause, you know, to minimize the efforts of the unions. I mean, you can't unionize a shop if you can't get the blacks and the whites in the same room, and it was illegal to meet together. And so this was a tough town, and it was a city that has its roots are different from any other city in the South, and so it was, you know, we were doomed to have some bad problems and experiences, and we had them, and now we're growing out of it. And I agree with you 100%. I think we need to embrace that history. If we can do it, anybody else can.
Absolutely.
You know, can come out of it. So I think that's it's a good testimony.
Let's go back to your book, because the way you wrote this book, you were very detailed. It's very intimate in that you gave us the characteristics of your mother and father. They seem like the typical hardworking, loving parents anyone else would have. And
That's
so
right.
sometimes when we think of a person who's a racist, we think of, oh, they're just hateful. They're just evil. But that wasn't so much the case. Again, it seems like because of the laws back in the day, they just adhered to them. And I'm not making an excuse. I'm setting up the foundation for your story.
I think you're right. I mean, my parents were good people. They were church going people. But the race thing was something very different. It was the way it was at the time. It was, and they didn't have the education. They didn't have the breadth of knowledge to look beyond it. They were just caught up in the Jim Crow culture. And I was fortunate that I had an opportunity to rise up out of that through Ms. Miller's help, and then, you know, reading and becoming educated, going to college and so forth. And so I came out of that. This is an important part. I don't think I could have written this book for loyalty to my father, because I didn't want to throw him under the bus.
Right.
Except that I think he did change, because after he retired from Greyhound, he went to work at a bank, and he was a mail clerk. He delivered mail, and that was in the late 70s and 80s. And the law had changed. There was no more segregation, at least by law. And he was delivering mail to his workers of color who had positions of influence and some power at the bank. I mean, he was delivering mail to these people whom he had previously said 20 years earlier to sit in the back of the bus. And so the thing, it reversed. He was the servant suddenly, and he got to know these people. I know he respected them, and I think he came to love them. And I've got a story about reconciliation. If you read that, I really think he did come to a closure on this.
Yes,
and
I
so,
love the way you. Oh, I'm sorry. Continue.
I don't think I could have written the book if I hadn't been able to include that chapter, because it's hard to you know. I didn't want to say anything about my dad that I couldn't fix. I feel strongly that he did reconcile.
Yes, yes. I love it how you all were sitting, and, you know, he began to talk to you about that. You all were sitting together, and you mentioned how a lot of times men do not allow their feelings to show. And so I did read that. What brings me to the story about the professor. This is a powerful story to me, because your father picked up a professor, I think it's from Talladega, and so, or Tuskegee, excuse me. And so your father began, although he wanted to make him sit in the back of the bus at this time, you know, you can pretty much, you know, the laws were they were changing a little, but he wanted to let him sit in the back of the bus, and your father began to have a conversation with him, and he said, this black man is intelligent, he's educated, and they literally had a wonderful conversation all the way back to their destination. But at the end of your dinner table, and I want you to tell us what happened. But
Instead of having a frustration when he came home, that particular day he was somewhat elated. He told us the story about talking to this man. He was well dressed, and he knew he was somebody of some importance. The guy, he sat down right, in the front seat, so my dad was able to talk with him. And he came home and says he was brilliant. He was bright. We talked about, this, that, and the other. He was just brilliant.
mm-hmm.
And I'm listening to this. I was about 15 years old, I guess, and I'm beginning, or maybe I was 16, but I was beginning to think about this whole situation about Jim Crow, and so he said, to sum it up, I guess he thought he'd been gushing a little bit, and he wanted to bring it back into perspective. And he says, but I don't care if the professor had 20 degrees,
Mm-hmm.
he's still not as good. He's not as good as we are. And I went away from the table at that time. I thought about that. And I thought about that for hours, trying to figure out if a man, if he were second class citizen, but now he's got a full college degree with multiple degrees behind his name, why wouldn't he be as good? Whatever that meant. And I don't know that he really meant that. I think he was just trying to pull the conversation back into some kind of, because he'd really been gushing about how bright this guy was.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure what his motivation was in saying that, but it really troubled me. And I worried about it, and I never forgot it, obviously.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. I want to take us back to how all of this began. One of the main characters in your story is Mr. Ace Carter.
Yes.
Who is over the White Citizens Council.
Yeah, he was also a Klansman, but I didn't know it at the time.
Yes, sir. And so what was amazing about this is, again, Chervis, you brought all this together because I'm seeing now where you all began to go to his meetings, and you liken him to almost the pastor or your church. This young man had great oratory skills. He was
he was a great orator.
Yes.
Charismatic.
Yes, and with anybody that would excite you, but it seems like he had an underlying motive, and he snuck it in throughout the book, and you and your parents were listening to this. Tell us about that, because it seems like that was a change in your thought pattern about race and it wasn't a positive change. Talk about that.
Well, I guess it begins with the Brown versus Board decision, and after that, the White Citizens Council sprung up to provide massive resistance to school integration. And my dad began going to the White Citizens Council meetings, and I went with him to a lot of them. And one of the speakers often was Ace Carter. His name was Asa Earl Carter. And he was a charismatic speaker, and I didn't remember the speech I had typed up in the book, put in the book. I got that at the public library, but it was essentially what he would say.
Yeah.
Talking about the problems with Reconstruction after the war, and he was a huge anti-communist, and he thought the whole civil rights movement was a part of the communist plot to have a race war in America and take over. It was just he was full of conspiracies. Like today, there's conspiracy theories about, out in the everywhere. You see them all the time. But back then, there were conspiracy theories too. Anyway, I finally have a chapter in there about going to see him. I was a very shy kid, but I did muster strength and energy to go see him one day, because I was balancing him on one side, Ms. Miller on the other. Ms. Miller is trying to counsel me to be, unbigoted, and he was counseling me to be bigoted. So I went to see him, and I've got a story there about how disappointed I was. It's called A Wrong Address.
Yes, I love that.
Literally, it was a wrong address, and I realized it when I left. He had not only failed to answer whatever questions I had, he had tried to use me to serve his own purposes in writing a story for his magazine, which I was not willing to do. I became very disillusioned with him and everything about him after that.
Yeah. Wonderful. The book, everyone, if you don't know, we're talking to author and attorney, Mr. Chervis Isom. We're talking about The Newspaper Boy. This is his amazing memoir of coming of age in the civil rights era. It's so riveting. I am so happy that I read this book. I finished reading the book the day before we talked, which was yesterday, Chervis. And you kind of joked with me. You was like, have you read the book? And I was
I asked you a question. I said, have you read it?
And so let me tell you why I'm so happy that I waited, because I was at the gym this morning and I took the book with me. So I was getting rid of some pounds and getting some extra information. And
Good.
I'm serious. I almost kind of fell off the treadmill because some of the things that I was reading really hit home. And I went back and I went to a couple of the chapters that I sent you the questions, because it touched me in a way, because some of the things that, although we think racism is dead and we're hoping we're moving forward, but there are some experiences that mirrored what's going on today. I want to back up just a little bit and paint this picture. You're a young boy in the city of Norwood. You watch this young African-American little boy make this. What would you liken it? Was it like a skateboard? Was it a car? What was it like?
Well, it was intended to be a car, but it was three pieces of wood nailed together. Essentially, it was a main part and then two cross beams, and he had skate wheels attached to it, and he steered it with a rope, like this. So it was just rudimentary skateboards, what it was, just very rudimentary, but he had built it himself, and he lived down off from where I lived, down on a dirt road by the railroad. And you can't run skates on dirt or rocks, so he brought the little car up to my street, and I saw him up there with it, and I wanted to ride so badly. I don't know, I was 8 or 9 years old. And he was a little older, maybe, but he had polio, and so he limped. His right side was not very operative. He limped and held his arm. His right arm was fairly useless, and so he couldn't make it go. It was a slight hill, but he couldn't make it go. And so, against all my better judgment, against all the teachings I'd ever have, that he was different. Words were not important. It was the writing that was important. And it's a very sad story, because then he came back another day and we played again. And then another day he came and brought the skating mobile to me and tried to give it to me. He said, "It's yours." And I said, "I can't take it. Why would you give it to me?" And he says, "They told me," I don't know who they told me I can't come up here no more to ride my skating mobile. Now, I don't know if my father may have told him, or somebody down the street, or whether his own parents told him that he couldn't come back. But essentially what he was saying is that, I don't belong up here on this paved street.
Well, my next statement is, that's what touched my heart, because just like sometimes African Americans may feel disadvantaged because of maybe their background, environment, or the way society has put limitations on us. And I know that sounds old. I know that sounds like, oh, that's back in the day. But some of that still happens. But when I read that story, it hurt my heart because here's a young boy. Obviously, he had some type of wonderful gift. He was bright. He built something. And yet he
Yes.
could not even use what he built in a place that should have been, open to him,
He could
for
not use
just like any
he
other
could not
child.
use
And that hurt my heart.
it hurt my heart. Yeah, it did. And then
Yeah.
I don't know how or why, but I forgot all about it. Then I became a teenager, and I didn't remember the story until I drove. You asked me about memories. Memories are hard to come by. You got to water the
Absolutely.
memories. You
Yeah.
got to plan them and take care of them, because if you don't ever think about them, they disappear. I never really thought much about my memories. I went back over to Norwood, and I was sitting there in my car on the street, and I'm looking down toward the railroad, and the road had been paved, and there were a lot of houses down there, whereas at the time of my story, there were only a few houses. And it was like suddenly I saw James walking up that dirt road, and I had forgotten it all those years, and the story came back to me as I sat there. I thought that was really interesting. Sometimes come back if you go to the place it happened. Memories sometimes fade, and sometimes you remember just like a little skeleton of it. You can't remember the muscles and the fat and everything. You just remember the skeletal story. And sometimes the thing comes back completely, and sometimes you can't remember the ending of the story, but you can, it comes back in pieces. And so, I think if you want to remember something, you go back to where it happened, and maybe you can pick up something that way. Writing these stories was easy because I had not thought about them in years and years and years. But the ones I wrote were vivid to me, the ones, because they had made it, like The Professor. That made an impact on me. I remember the conversation because he was so cheerful. It had been a good experience for him, not a negative experience like a lot of the experiences he had.
Yeah.
And I remember that.
Yeah. I love it how you bring us into the story, but not only do you talk about the issues of race, you talk about you growing up being just a young boy, experiencing girls, experiencing women, experiencing life.
I do have a few of those stories too.
But it made this real because you were a young adolescent growing up. So it brought a balance to it, that we just didn't see this young boy that's just racist and just has a certain worldview. We viewed you as someone who's real, touchable, and you went through the very things that any boy would go through. Doesn't matter what color they were. So do you want to talk about any of those stories, Miss Tally? Any of those stories?
Yeah, I don't really think that's appropriate for me to talk about Miss Tally, but
No, let's not
I will say this.
That's tobacco.
If you're writing a book and it's a serious topic, as I was dealing with, it's important to break up the serious chapters with something maybe a little lighter. And I tried to do that. And, in a way, I was embarrassed to put in the story about Miss Tally, but hey, it was good. I mean, I was maybe 16 or 17. I was probably 16, and I got a big kiss. She scared me to death. But after that, she got a free paper because I was never able to go back to collect again. So that
she got something out of the deal.
I'm just glad that it has had an impact with a few people, and if I can bring the importance of what two people can do, Mr. and Ms. Miller, and how they helped me come of age by helping me overcome the problems I grew up with of racism, helped me come out of that. I'm sure I would have eventually, but they jump started it.
Yeah.
That's one of the reasons I wanted to write the book, to thank them. And I dedicated the book to them, and they're still alive, and I'm in contact with them.
Yeah. Let's get a little more serious, because this is one chapter that you did want me to talk about. And it was the chapter entitled Arizona. That was riveting because that particular chapter also mirrors what happens even today. And
I'm sure it does happen today, but back in the day of Jim Crow, it was the only way it happened. And and story, I was a college boy, and I got out of school for the summer, and I had a job at a pipe distributorship. And my job, along with several others, was loading and unloading pipe off of trucks and putting it on the ground and then shipping it out to somebody. And that was the job. And Arizona was a laborer. He must have been 50 years old. And his boss was a young guy, probably 25-year-old, country boy, redneck to the bone. And it took me about 2 or 3 days to realize Arizona knew every aspect of the job, could do everything, and could do it well. And he should have been the foreman. And the redneck boy should have been his employee, his helper. But that's not the way it was in 1961 in Birmingham, Alabama. And so the talent and ingenuity that Arizona had was wasted, really, because he was not prone to show what he knew unless he was called on to do it. Because I think he probably felt if I show them how to do things, they will think I'm, being uppity or something. So he just laid back and did what he was told to do, and he did it well. And I was just, I grieved over that the whole summer. And at the end of the summer, he and I had I wanted to take him out for a drink. But it was illegal to go to a place to have a drink with him. It was illegal because we were different color, and we'd been put in jail. So I sat in my car and drank a small bottle of whiskey and talked about his lot in life. And here I felt so inadequate. Here's a man 50 years old, raised his family, had nothing to look forward to. His dreams were, empty. And I'm sitting there, a college boy, and everything looks good for me. And I'm going, my arc is going up, and of course his was going down. And it was just a real education to me, and more than an education, it was an emotional ringing out. I just felt that I had finally understood what Jim Crow was all about, and it was heartbreaking. And I'll never forget Arizona.
Yeah. It seems now, and in the book you talk about this, and I don't want to give too much away because I really want people to get the book. I want them to read it. I want them to feel what I felt. In the beginning, I was happy-go-lucky, and after 3 chapters, I wrote you an email. I said, Chervis, I'm enjoying this book. And you said, hold up, DeShawn, you need to finish the book because there are some controversial things and things you may not like that may make you angry.
We had to go through the bad part first before I could come out of talk about an evolution.
Absolutely.
So,
yeah.
So I pretty much described what Jim Crow was all about, and there is also some research I put for people. I got a feeling that today these young people, probably black or white, don't know what Jim Crow means. So I put a 3-page definition, an explanation of what Jim Crow was, and so people could, if they're not familiar with it. I expect all your listeners are familiar with it, but there are a lot of school kids right now probably never heard of it, and that needs to be remembered, and it needs to be things we about and make sure we never go there again.
I remember in elementary school, it was middle school, And this was the late 80s, maybe early 90s. I'm aging myself. But anyways, I was in middle school. And so I left something in my locker and I had to go back and get it. And lo and behold, there were 6 beautiful girls who I looked up to. They were more of the popular girls. And mind you, Chervis, this is the second time I've told this story because I kept it hidden because I didn't believe what I heard at that time. I mean, we're talking about late 80s going into early 90s. So I'm at my locker getting my books that I forgot. And I hear the friends that I look up to they said, have you met our new history teacher? And so the young other lady said, no, we haven't met her. What's wrong with her? And then she started giggling and saying, well, she's Black. And so they were looking like, oh my gosh, like that was a bad thing. Now I know that sounds small, but I felt so helpless. I felt so sad. I can't even describe the totality of the feeling or the impact that had on me, because here in the 80s, 90s, late 80s, early 90s, this mindset was still going on. And we're all young, but we understand that was the past. But here I'm hearing my friends who smile in my face, who I go to school with every day, who I play with on the playground, make a statement like that. So with that said,
how old were you?
I was about 12 or 13.
Yeah, I'm sure it was.
But with that said, it is important that we understand history and we break the mindset or the worldview of some of the people that have the same racist views today. Now, I want to go back to Vern. Was it Vern and Helen Miller? Was it the Millers?
Yes. Yes.
I want to go back to them because throughout the book, they were changing your mind. They weren't rude. They weren't pushy. But every time you came with some type of racist worldview, Miss Miller was so kind, but she changed your mindset with her calm, sweet demeanor. Tell us about that.
And her good looks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You emphasize that again.
I mean, if she'd been middle-aged woman, I may not have listened so carefully, but she was probably 25 and she was pretty. Yeah, but she changed my view in lots of ways, made me less change my view and more made me think deeply about it at a time when I probably wouldn't have been thinking about it at all. And, when I got into college, I'm sure I would have begun thinking about it, but she had me thinking about it when I was 16 and 17. And, mm-hmm. and to make someone think deeply about a person's culture or a person's religion or a person's things that are important, that's, you can't think about it too early. And so 16, 17 years old was a good age for me to begin coming to grips with this stuff. Mm-hmm. And she caused me to come to grips with it. And I'm not going to say she changed me over a year or 2 years, but she had me thinking about it and had me in a mindset to be open to what I was learning. And it takes time. Changing your culture is a little bit like, changing your religion or changing something very important to you. It eats away at you. It eats at your conscience and eats at your mind. And it's things you think about deeply. And that's what she caused me to do when I was probably old enough to think about it, but I wouldn't have been thinking about it but for her.
Let's talk about your law practice. Did you becoming a lawyer, and I'm just asking this personally because I know you're more of a real estate lawyer. You can talk about that a little later, but did that put a fight in you where you wanted to fight for justice? Did you make your decision based on, okay, all of my experiences, maybe I could help this turmoil that's going on in our world by becoming a lawyer? Did those thoughts come to your mind, Chervis?
Not so much. Let me back up and say that my life was changed 3 times because of the newspaper. I was a really shy kid, and when I got my newspaper right at 13, I was forced to go knock on doors and collect for the paper and have to deal with people, adults. And I learned a lot. And one of the things I learned is that it's important to come out of my shell and really, grow up in that respect, because I'm extremely shy. The second time the newspaper changed my life was when Ms. Miller moved on to my paper route and began coaching me and counseling me.
Mm-hmm.
And the third time was when I was reading the newspaper after I was in college and later. I was reading the editorial pages of the newspaper, kept seeing letters written to the paper by Abe Berkowitz. And he was a lawyer here, and he wrote letters in opposition to Bull Connor, our police chief, and and he really would take issue with him. And then he wrote a letter in defense of John Kennedy, our president, who was being vilified because he was Catholic. And I was a big John Kennedy supporter. And then John Kennedy was killed 10 days after that letter was in the newspaper. I never forgot that. And then when I was in law school, 18 months later, in my first year of law school, I needed a summer job. I wanted a job with a lawyer. I didn't know any lawyers, and I knew his name was Berkowitz, and I didn't have a sense. I was blue collar to the bone. I didn't know anything. I went to see him for a job. I didn't call for an interview. I just showed up in his office, and he was kind and saw me and talked with me. And eventually, I went to work with Abe Berkowitz. Was a civil rights lawyer. I mean, he was involved as early as 1948. He pressed the legislature in Alabama himself alone, pretty much, to have the Klan unmasked, and there was a law signed that anti-masking statute was passed that struck the Klan, said you can't cover your face anymore. He did that in 1948. So he was a major force in civil rights, and I went to work for him, but I never worked in. I mean, he was the man. I was working to keep the office going, and other people too. And I found myself eventually in real estate, and I worked 50 years. This past June, I finished 50 years of work, and but I never really was involved in civil rights. I wrote this book, and it's a story of my experiences, and it's a story of not so much about me, but the story of what one person, Ms. Miller, could do to affect the life of someone else. And I and you and all your listeners can do the same thing. You can affect someone's life by counseling with them, to help them get on a better track than their own. And I think the power of one to influence someone else is enormous. And we just have to, that was really what I was trying to say in the book. It was a book about my evolution, but it also goes back to how one person really put me on the right path. And I wanted to say thank you to her, and I dedicated the book to her and her husband. They were both very helpful to me. And as I said, they're still alive here in Birmingham. I think he's 94 and she's about 89, I think. But
wow.
Yeah, and so I see them occasionally. But I did go to their house and I said thank you, and then eventually I got the book written. Yeah. So that's kind of the story of it. But it's about me, but it's about what people have done for me. What Abe Berkowitz did for me. He took me in. I was a kid off the street, just from North Side. I was not Jewish, but he took me in, embraced me, and made me a partner within 3 years. And I had a great career with him and his firm. And I don't know. I didn't deserve that, but I'm very pleased it happened to me.
Yeah.
I didn't really go to law school with the idea of justice and all that. I had a wife and a 6-month-old baby, and we were going backwards. I had to find a way to make a living. So law school, and it paid off for me. I paid my worked. I worked at Sears Roebuck selling men's clothes, and that's how I worked my way through school. And my wife was a teacher, and so, but I never took a dime from him. He did, but he brought me in a law firm when I finished law school, and that was what he did. Yeah. He also,
what an honor.
He didn't have a place for me when I went. Yeah, he got me a job at another law firm.
Yeah. Chervis, because this is such a powerful book. I'm sorry, you broke up.
You broke up.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So it's on me. You're blaming me. It's okay.
Go.
Okay, are we good now?
We're good. We're good.
Okay.
You're always
okay. Before we go any further, because you too, Mr. Chervis. Now, before we go any further, I know you didn't want me to say that because you say you're not your father, so I'm going to say Chervis. That's hard for me. You know, I'm from Birmingham. You know how we were taught.
Well, everything's hard. You're doing good.
Well, I'm going to finish this conversation at a later time. This is too powerful because I want people to truly hear us and see us clearly, Chervis. So I'm going to invite you back for a part 2. Would you come back and talk to us about this amazing book? Because this is too good for anything to happen.
I'd be glad to do it anytime you say. This has been fun.
Yes, sir. Now, how can they get the book? I know the website, but you tell us how they get the book.
If you live in Birmingham, you can get it at Alabama Booksmith or Little Professor, 2 or 3 other places. It's on Amazon, and there's a paperback on Amazon. It sells for $18.95, and you can get it there. There's also some other used books on Amazon, which maybe are cheaper. They're all hardback, I suppose, but Amazon's got them. So and you just look up the Newspaper Boy, and there it is. Also, if you want to look at the my website, it's easy to find. It's www.thenewspaperboy.net, and you can see reviews, summaries of the book. And I have a blog there, which I don't blog very often, but I've got, 4 or 5 or 6 entries, some of which are pretty interesting. And I hope all are interesting, but but I would invite your viewers to look at the website, and there's a lot of information there.
Wonderful.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Chervis, for being with us this evening. This has been so much fun. I appreciate you. Thank you for this wonderful gift to the world.
Let me say how I know you. I know you through your good sister in Birmingham, DeShawn Bivens. And she works at my law firm, and she and I have a good relationship. It's a pleasure to meet her sister. She is. Say hello to DeShawn.
Yes, I'm so happy because she made this interview possible. She speaks so highly of you, Chervis. She talks about how humble you are, and she just tells me how she enjoys working for the law firm. So thank you so much. Thank you, my sister. Yes, I have to give her a big shout out. She's a go-getter. She's a go-getter.
She is. All right, you are too. All right. So I'll be happy to visit with you again.
Thank you. And I'll see you soon in Birmingham. Have a great evening, Chervis.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.
Well, that was my guest, attorney Chervis Isom, and his book, The Newspaper Boy. If you would like to get a copy, the information is right here, and I think you should. You will enjoy this book. It is life-changing, and it's definitely a game changer. Thank you so much for watching Live with DeShawn. Join me next week for another motivating show where I bring you more hope, more inspiration, and more motivation. Again, if you would like to see this interview in its entirety, join me on my Facebook page, my YouTube channel, or my Twitter page. Again, thank you, and I will see you on the next episode. Have a great day.